Well, we're continuing our study in Daniel, and last week we went through chapter 9 and talked about, spent the majority of our time on Daniel's prayer for the nation and the confession of his sins and the sins of the nation, and asking for God's mercy and grace. And it's an excellent example of how we can pray. It's an excellent example of how we can pray and the attitude and the position of our heart that we should have as we go into talking to God. At the end of that, there's a section that was labeled as 70 weeks or 77s, and that was a prophecy about what would happen between Daniel's time and the coming of the Messiah, and then the destruction of Jerusalem. So we talked about the 7 weeks. Really, it appears to be the first small section of time where the temple would be rebuilt and sacrifices would be reestablished in the temple, and it would be the reconnecting of the people with God through their worship. And then the city would be rebuilt, the walls would be rebuilt. He did warn it would be times of difficulty and times of trouble. So if that happened, or when that happened, they wouldn't be discouraged. They wouldn't think, something must be wrong. God isn't following through on his promises to us. No, he told them to expect those troubles so that when they did happen, they would know that things were still on track. And then the long period of the 70 weeks, there's a 62-week section there, and that really represents the time from once that 7 weeks is over and the city's rebuilt and the temple is restarted to the coming of the Messiah. And that would be the long wait that they would have. And a big part of the reason of Daniel's written, I believe, is to give them that reassurance throughout that period of silence between the testaments. Just to give them a long view and to give them some short-term and long-term prophecies so that they could see as prophecies were fulfilled, that would give them more and more faith that the rest of the prophecies would eventually be fulfilled as well, and that God was still with them. So then, and then the last week really is representing the establishment of the church and to the destruction of Jerusalem. And then a lot of premillennial doctrine will say that there's a gap in there, and there's the church age, and because things didn't go as God had planned. And it's almost makes me cringe whenever I say that, the way that, that they don't describe it that way, but the things didn't go right, and so they had to have a Band-Aid program that we'll have this church age, and then eventually we'll get to the last week where Christ will reign on this earth for 1,000 years. And nothing in the scriptures indicates that is has any truth to it. And so we can see that last week really is the coming of the church age and the changeover, because the sacrifices and proper worship under the Jewish system would no longer be possible after the destruction of the temple and the records and so forth. So we got to the last couple verses there. So that, and it was talking about we'll just read it. After 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And we just talked about that being Jesus, that when he died, he gave up, he didn't have anything. And he would be seen as, by the world as a failure. But be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with the flood, and to the end of there shall be war. desolations are decreed. So that prince of the people is the Roman army coming to destroy Jerusalem. And we see in 27, and he will make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So, the desolations are decreed. God has spoken. This is going to happen. And he shall make a covenant. I believe this is talking about the prince of the people. Make a covenant with the people for 1 week. And for half the week, or 3.5 days, if you're dividing it literally in half, then end the sacrifice and offerings. So I think this correlates to the destruction or the siege of Jerusalem. I was under siege, under attack for 3.5 years, and there was times where there would be more aggressive attack, and then there would be times where the armies would be pulled back, and the people would be able to, that wanted to, would be able to leave. And the Christians were supposed to be in that group. And as from we know from history, it's reported that no Christians died in the destruction of Jerusalem. But I think this really fits well. If we just jump to Matthew 24, they ask, when will this end come? As he talked about how the buildings would be totally destroyed, no stone left on another. And they ask, tell us when these things will come. And so he describes some of the things to watch out for. In verse 15, he says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in the house, and let the one who is in the field not go back to take his cloak. So he just identifies when you see this happening, the abomination of desolation. And in other places, it's the I can't remember the exact wording. The Roman or the armies. It says when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Yes. So when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So in case they didn't know what the abomination of desolation was, there's a divine interpretation of it. And so these people are warned about this thing that Daniel spoke of, and so they can see. I think they had already been seeing, and we're going to see in chapters 11 and 12, very small, not small, but very minute detail prophecies that they would be able to see that they were being fulfilled throughout the time. And I think this is how they knew that the time was near when Jesus came. And so, or at least how they should have known. I think many people did heed those things that they read, and I think a lot of people just read right over them and didn't really get the message, and so they were not prepared for the coming of Christ. But then to tie it together and help them understand when these things would happen, he gave them a description of what to look for, what to be on watch for. But then in verse 34 of Matthew 24, he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So in case there was any doubt, there was not going to be a long church age or some other intermediate period where things had to be done and because it couldn't go as planned. Now, Jesus said, here's what has been foretold, and it's going to happen, so be on watch for it. And it's going to happen within this generation. So some of these people would not pass away before this would happen. So that really kind of covers chapter 9, finishes it up because we kind of ended abruptly. But as we look then in chapter 10, we see another vision that Daniel will have. Any questions on any of that through chapter 9? All right. So in chapter 10, Well, we'll do our quick overview, review. Just the themes to remember as we go through. God rules in the kingdoms of men, and that's really the main focus of these last several chapters. And then also be faithful in suffering. We won't review those because we're focusing on the 8 through 12 now at this point. And so these are visions that further expand and further explain what some of the previous visions had been about. The vision of the metallic man had laid the groundwork on these, and then in the vision in chapter 9 of the four beasts then gave more information, and really as we go through these different parts will be highlighted and details given, whether it's the Medes and Persians, the Greeks, or the Romans. So to give us our context once again in history, we're in the at the end of the Babylonian captivity, and we remember Belshazzar was the king at the end of the Babylonian Empire, and Cyrus took over for the Persians. And Darius was the king of the area of Babylon in particular. One interesting thing I just came across today, I don't know if this was due to my Google checking my searching habits or what, but I found in the Smithsonian mag.com, archaeologists discovered 2,500-year-old carving of the last king of Babylon. And so they identified the king. And did we talk about who the actual last king of Babylon was? I don't think I mentioned him by name. It was Nabonidus. He's up there. He was actually the king. And Belshazzar was a co-regent, a co-king that really was, again, just in charge of Babylon area, it appears. And so this article talks about, let's see. Well, it actually talked about some of the details we had about how he was the king, but he maybe had ruffled the feathers of the people of Babylon. So he had gone to a different city to rule from, and had left Belshazzar there. And then it talks about how he named his son co-regent, and Nabonidus, who ruled Babylonia from 556 to 539. So these numbers that are on our slides aren't just made up. These are real historical dates. And so we can just get little things like that give us just a little more encouragement, saying, hey, you're on the right track. This is true. And because we know that the history of it is true, and we see the prophecies fulfilled in that history, it just is very reassuring to our faith. So I saw Daniel 9 was written in the first year of Cyrus, and then Daniel 10 will be in the third year, so it'll be around 536. And 10, 11, and 12 appear to be one large vision and event. And so those are all together grouped there. So we saw, again, these representations of these kingdoms, the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Greek, and Roman. And we'll go into more detail on the dates in the coming chapters. But again, I think we covered that pretty well, of discussing what the 77s are. So we'll move on to chapter 10. So we're starting in verse 1 of chapter 10. In the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. And the word was true, and it was a great conflict. And he understood the word and had understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. So, first of all, Daniel has a vision. And I think this is a new vision that he doesn't really go into detail on, but it is very upsetting. It's one of great conflict, and that's great warfare. He understood it, and that probably is what made it worse. Because, if sometimes with these visions, if he saw them, he might be upset about them, but when you know the detail of what does this represent, what is the reality of what's going to happen in this negative sense, like when Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where Daniel didn't even want to tell him what it was, then it has even more of an effect once he knows the meaning and the details and understands it. And so we have, so because of this dream, apparently, he was in mourning for 3 weeks, and he was fasting, did not anoint himself with oil. I think that just showed he was not living a comfortable life. He wasn't eating the good foods, and he wasn't having that soothing or comforting oil. It's kind of like when ashes and sackcloth kind of situation. Any comments so far on? Yes? All right. So this was, again, like we said, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, so 536. And he identifies himself, kind of a reset, that this is the same Daniel from the beginning, the one that was renamed Belteshazzar, but he doesn't go by that name, at least as much as he can. Then in verse 4 through 9, we have Daniel's second vision. And it says in verse 4, "On the 24th day of the 1st month, I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris. I lifted up my eyes and looked, and beheld a man clothed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude." We're just going to stop there for a second and look at this description. So, going back to the setting of this vision, he was on the 24th day of the 1st month. Does anybody know what happens in the 1st month of the Jewish calendar? We don't usually... Passover, yes. So Passover, I believe, was around the 3rd week. So this would have been just after Passover. I don't know how much people were observing Passover during that time in Babylon, but with the Jews going back to Jerusalem, hopefully they were observing it there. But, and it's interesting that the people have been allowed to go back to Jerusalem already, but yet Daniel's still here. Any ideas or suggestions why Daniel might still be there? Larry?
Still being a servant to the leadership. Seems like he's been called on a number of times throughout his...
Right.
I mean, he's an old guy.
Yeah. And let's keep in mind, how old approximately would he be? So, however old he was when he went into Babylon, plus 70. So, yeah, if he was 20, then he would be 90 years old, but at least late 80s. And so he had really established his place in being a valuable and useful tool of the administrations that had gone before. And I think the ones coming in afterwards saw the value and saw the wisdom, especially of keeping this man who's almost 90 years old and had such a successful past. And so some people think that, well, why didn't Daniel go back if he had the opportunity? Why give up? Wouldn't he be more useful for the people there in Jerusalem? But I think, first of all, if God had told him to go back, I think he would have gone. And I just think that he didn't feel that God had moved him to go back. God had put him in this place to do this work, and I think he was doing what he thought God wanted him to do. Mike?
I was going to come to that conclusion that he probably didn't have a choice.
Right. It's very likely, just because they let the people go back, it doesn't release the employment of the helpers and the officials and so forth. So he may not have had a choice. Julie?
No little trip back to Jerusalem.
True.
What is it, 1,600 miles or?
I don't remember, but
Went across the United States.
even,
And he's close
at
to
age
90.
90, right. And it wasn't a comfortable trip. We were talking about how in Mark's lesson, he talked about Laura Ingalls Wilder going from their South Dakota home down to Missouri and it taking several weeks. And I made that drive in one day, and it seems like, oh, well, that's not that far. But, in a comfortable, relaxing vehicle, with cruise control, they didn't have any of that back then. And so it would have been a very arduous journey. So Daniel has this vision and describes this person clothed in linen, a belt of fine gold, body like beryl, his face like appearance of lightning, eyes like flaming torches, his arms like the gleam of burnished bronze, his word like the sound of a multitude. Does this sound familiar, John?
Description of Christ in the first chapter of Revelation.
Right, so if we look in Revelation chapter 1, through 6, 12 through 16. We see, then I turned to see a voice that was speaking to me, and on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe, the golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white like wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held out 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. So this description in Revelation is John writing using terminology that people would be familiar with, right? He was using Daniel language. And so while we see this description in Revelation of the Son of Man, Jesus, so who do you think the being described in Daniel is? The Christ? I'm going to say I don't think so. And I don't know what the split is on how many people think it is and how many don't think so. But I think this is a very powerful angelic being, spiritual being. And I think the description of Christ in Revelation is this plus more. It puts the Son of Man in Revelation on a higher plane than he's got all the things that this one has, and then he's got more. Like with the 7 stars in his hand, the sharp two-edged sword in his mouth, his face shining like the sun in full strength. Those are above and beyond the person of Daniel that's described. And we'll see another reason in a few minutes here of why I'm leaning toward that this is not Jesus. But what do we know about this individual?
Power and authority.
Power and authority. That's it. I mean, that's pretty much sums it up. They have power and authority, and since they're a spiritual being, it's power and authority coming from God. And so Daniel we see in verse 7, "And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision. But a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw the great vision, and no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. So first of all, he's the only one who actually sees the vision of the man. And then those who are with him have some sort of sense of this great power near them. And it freaks them out. They go running and trying to hide. They have nothing to, they don't see anything, they don't hear anything, but it's just that knowledge of that spiritual power nearby that just sends them running. And like, hey, good friends, just leave Daniel there. So Daniel's left by himself, and he sees the vision, and he, no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed. So this is kind of funny, is the radiant appearance of a 90-year-old man. So he probably still had, some health to him, and was could be what's the word? Vital, some vitality, but not now. Now all of his strength left him, and he retained no strength. And so it's just totally drained by this vision. And that's common when we see, like if we look in, or if we just, we can look at it. In Acts chapter 9, this may have sounded familiar because the conversion of Saul, when he's on the road to Damascus, he sees Jesus, and now in 9:3 it says, "Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And he said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Arise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do.' The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one." So, and then we'll just go on a little bit further. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were open, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. So, whether it's an angel, and we see examples of just about any time angels appear to people, they are, they faint. They fall to the ground, whether they still have their consciousness or not. It's just a totally overwhelming experience. And so we see that that's how it is for Daniel. And this is even more than the overwhelming experiences he's had in the past, because this angel appears to be even more powerful. Bruce?
We know in the Old Testament that God the Son was prevalent, that his influence and his appearance came before his people, and so I think it's a toss-up, as to whether it's the Christ or another angelic being.
Right, and we kind of have a hard time relating to the spiritual power that God and Jesus and angels have. But even when God would meet with Moses in the tent of meeting, Moses would come out glowing, and it really scared the people. They're like, we don't want anything to do with this. You handle everything, with God, and we'll talk to you, you talk to God. We don't want to take any chances.
He didn't mess with Moses.
Right. So in, let's see, where are we now? Hear the sound of the words. I think that's where we are. So in verse 9, it says, "Then I heard the sound of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in a deep sleep with my face to the ground." So he was already kind of, wasted by this, and then he's just out on the ground, face down. I hate to laugh at him, but it's just kind of a comical image. But and it takes him a little while to recover. We see verse 10, and behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. So it's not clear to me if this is the hand of the one who had appeared or just an invisible hand that helped him up. But, kind of pick him up and put him on his hands and knees and let him get his breath again and see if he can compose himself. And he said to me, "O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for now I have been sent to you." And when he had spoken these words, I stood up trembling. So, first of all, I don't know if there's anything miraculous about this kind of re-strengthening of Daniel, or just how great would it be to get that message from an angel. "Oh, Derek, man greatly loved." And it's come from an angel. That's just something that I feel better already, So he stands him up and he's trembling. And then he said to me, "Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words." The prince, let's stop there. So this is a lot like the last discussion with Gabriel, how as soon as he started praying to God, Gabriel was sent. And this is as soon as he humbled himself and set to understand. And so I think this goes back to that first vision we were talking about, the one that really shook him and caused him to spend 3 weeks fasting and praying and so forth. But he said, from the first day you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. So that's another example of Daniel being humble, approaching God with the proper heart and proper spirit, and another great example for us of how we should respond to anything, how we should respond to getting news, whether it's good news or bad news, events in our lives. We should always look to understand God's will in it. So then this gets into the fun part. "The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia, and came to make you understand what is to happen for your people in the latter days, for the vision is for days yet to come." So we get some insight into angelic activity. It's interesting. He says the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. So it sounds like I heard you as soon as you started praying, and I wanted to come immediately, but the prince of Persia withstood me for 21 days. What do you think? Who do you think the prince of Persia is? John?
To me, it sounds like this is a spiritual battle going on, and it would probably be a figure that was in the spiritual realm, if it's an angel who's talking.
Okay, so a spiritual...
spiritual battle that's fought in the spiritual realm.
Right, that spiritual counterpart of whoever this being is. I think that makes the most sense to me from what I'm reading here, is that to simplify it to something we can all understand, because we've seen this in the past, it's like those cartoons where there is an angel and a devil in the shoulder. There's the prince of Persia was a little devil trying to cause problems of some kind, trying to lead Persia into sin. He might have been trying to revoke the command, or somehow change the command of letting the people go back to Jerusalem and rebuild, or maybe they couldn't revoke that, but they could do other things to make it more difficult. There was something going on that was trying to cause evil to happen and sin to happen, and this angel had to step in and wage war of some kind. What exactly that looks like, how that works, I have no idea, but Mike is going to tell us.
One thing I'm trying to tell you is whoever this Prince of Persia is one bad Jose. If he went toe to toe.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's something to pay attention to. First of all, this is the main reason I don't think that this being is Christ, because I don't think Jesus would have been overpowered by the Prince of Persia, or would have had to take 21 days to overcome him. But you're right. This is, when we look at how much power and authority this being has, for the Prince of Persia to be able to withstand him for 21 days, we have to, lack of a better word, respect the danger that those evil spirits can pose. Molly, did you have?
Well, I was going to say, and then I don't know if we've actually gotten to it because I was kind of thinking my own thoughts. And it says, Michael came to help me. Well, I don't think the Messiah would need help.
Right. I agree. And I think we've not gotten there yet, but I'm in agreement on that. Steve?
We could speculate quite a bit on this, but what we do know is it was a being associated with Persia that could resist other beings that seem to be trying to carry out God's will.
Right.
But his authority came from God. So it was someone God placed or allowed to have a level of control. And but you also see God is giving future prophecies, and it seems like those future prophecies are being resisted. So before he could give word, here's what's going to happen, they had to make sure that was arranged.
Right. Yeah.
But then you also see later in the chapter, Michael is Daniel's representative.
Right.
Daniel's prince. And so Israel, likely Israel had a prince as well. Their nation had a representative that had authority in the spiritual realm, or to represent them to God or whatever. But you see that in the Old Testament multiple times, like with Job. There's this panel that are meeting with God, and they're discussing things that happen on earth.
Yep.
But it's a spiritual panel. And then you see another time when God's like, okay, I need a deceiving spirit to go out and deceive these people. Who's going to go do it? And this one guy pipes up and says, I will. It's like, all right, go deceive them. And they had the power to give false prophecy to the false prophets, so they could deceive the nations. And so you see that there's, and also, just this is kind of a side note, all the Greek gods, like the way that they understood the Greek gods and the demons and things like that, is there was some sort of hierarchy. And the way the Jewish exorcists would cast out demons is they do it by the name of a higher demon. And they had some level of success doing that. And that's where the 7 sons of Sceva, they're trying to use Jesus' name. And the response is, well, I know Paul and I know Jesus, but who are you?
Right.
So there was some of that, something going on, which we don't see as much now because Jesus is King of Kings and Satan has been removed from access to heaven. But you can see that there are other angelic beings that have teamed up with Satan to some extent. But his power's been limited in our day, but in their day you see that there was some influence, and maybe some of those false gods had some form of representative spiritually,
Right.
that allowed people to be deceived by them.
And that's one thing I think is a big part of it, is that before and after Christ, I think there was a different kind of spiritual warfare going on. I think it's still going on now, but I think many of the weapons and tools that they had access to before, those got shut down when Christ took away Satan's power.
I think maybe a better way to put it is they can't make a claim.
Right.
Where before, and you see this in Revelation 12, Satan was making a claim, and so he was resisting Michael because he had a claim over souls of men or whatever it was. He had a legitimate claim, but they overcame by the blood of the Christ.
Right.
Because Jesus' blood removed any claim they had in heaven. And so now his only claim is, within the kingdoms of men. And that's what Satan even presented himself to Jesus. He's like, I have authority all these things, and I'll give them to you. Which means, Satan is the prince of something. Maybe the prince of the world is the prince of, prince
Right.
of, and I think maybe Ephesians said something to that.
Prince of the power of the air.
Yeah.
Yep. Larry, did you have a comment?
I was thinking that it was possibly a reference to the king of Persia and whether Satan was trying to use his influence in a way that was contrary to God's or something, but that's kind of what I was.
Yeah, it appears to me that there's a differentiation between the Prince of Persia and the kings of Persia. That the Prince of Persia appears to be a spiritual entity, whereas, and is the one that is influencing the kings of Persia that are actually the physical people carrying out the work. That's how it appears to me. Any other? Julie?
1 Corinthians 15:24 kind of gives us a little insight into possibly what's going on behind the scenes. When it says, then comes the end when he delivers the kingdom of God, the Father, after destroying every rule and every authority and power.
Yeah. Yep, and that is a good verse. And then also, and again, in case couldn't hear, is 1 Corinthians 15:24. Then comes the end when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father after destroying every rule and every authority and power. And then if we look over in Revelation, well, let's hit Ephesians on the way there. Chapter 2 and verse 2. And we'll start in 1. And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. So there's that spiritual warfare that's still going on. And then in Revelation 12, we'll read the first part here. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and her head, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled in the wilderness where she was a place prepared by God, in which she was to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. So there we see the conquering battle of Michael over the dragon and through the power of Christ. But I think that it still stands that this warfare, the spiritual warfare, is continuing now. Steve?
On the night Jesus was crucified, he said multiple times to his disciples, the ruler of this world is being cast down. So you kind of see a parallel there with
Right.
what you just read in Revelation.
Yep.
Jesus correlates the same thing.
That's the event that is causing him to be cast down. So, let's see where we are. So we got down to through 14. Yeah, I think that's right. So before we go on, any other comments or questions? Maurice?
The time frame is that kind of the 21 days that it took him to get there? Did that kind of be in correlation to the 3 weeks that he was fasting?
That's my understanding. Yeah, I understand that he's had this vision. He was so affected by it that he began fasting and praying, and when he started that process is when the message was sent, and he was started trying to come to him, and it took 21 days. So then as we go on are we in 15? It said, when he had spoken to me according to these words, I turned my face. Well, first of all, the last thing he said was that I came to make you understand that what is to happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision is days yet to come. So he's explaining this, whatever this terrible vision Daniel had, it's about his people, and he's going to explain it to him. And so when he had spoken to me according to these words, I turned my face toward the ground and was mute. So he just lost power. This was a setback for him. So he, in verse 16, and behold, one in the likeness of the children of man touched my lips. Then I opened my mouth and spoke. I said to him who stood before me, O my Lord, by reason of the vision, pains have come upon me, and I retain no strength. How can my Lord's servant, and I think that's him referring to himself, talk with my Lord? And for now no strength remains in me, and no breath is left in me. So he's just really worn out by this, and he can barely stand the process. Mike?
I'm kind of curious about this one statement in here, children of man. That doesn't seem real common to me.
Other places,
The Son of Man.
right.
You got a good reference to that I'm not.
Well, in the previous chapters, he described Gabriel as having the appearance of a son of man. And so I don't think that was being used exclusively as the way that we talk about Jesus as the Son of Man.
Right, the context determines who is
Right.
referenced to.
And so I think this is just the very similar, just using children of men in the same way that it wasn't, the person who appeared to have touched him, it looks like wasn't the same person that was first described. So this was some other spiritual being that was helping and less taxing to Daniel's emotions and body, I guess.
My Bible says one who resembles human.
Okay, one who resembles a human, depending on what version you use. So he's just really not sure how he's going to be able to continue this discussion. In verse 18, again, one having the appearance of a man, so just a little bit different wording on that one, touched me and strengthened me. And he said, O man, greatly loved, fear not, peace be with you. Be strong and of good courage. And as he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. So this, I feel like this is a good memory verse, or a good verse to have in your back pocket of inspirational Bible quotations. Because we can, as we do our best to fulfill that role, we can place ourselves in this role of one who's greatly loved, because we are. God loves us, and He wants us to be okay. He wants us to be safe and whole. And so He says to him, O man greatly loved, fear not, peace be with you, be strong and of good courage. And other versions just say, be strong, yes, be strong. And as he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. So he was strengthened, and he said, I can do this. Let's continue. You've made it possible for me to carry on. And then he says, then he said, "Do you know why I've come to you? But now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince. And as for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him." And I tacked on verse 1 of chapter 11 because I think it is a lot better chapter break right there. But again, this is just a really interesting insight, a little peek into what the spiritual warfare is going on, because like Steve said, that's all we know, just this little bit, and we can guess about what it, all the details of it, but there's really no point. The purpose of us knowing this is, I believe, to give us strength and courage that God is fighting for us in the spiritual realm, both then and now. And so we see he was going to return and fight against the prince of Persia. And when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come. I think that just means when he's done with the prince of Persia, then Greece will come, and which matches up with the prophecies we've heard before. And then, as he says, I will tell you what's inscribed in the book of truth. I think that's his intro to chapter 11 and 12, where he's going into detail about the vision. Steve?
Another thing just to take note of is Daniel said a prayer. That's what started all this.
Right.
It is a war started in heaven because Daniel said a prayer which caused God to issue an order. And you just think about, what God does. He doesn't act on our behalf in a weak way or in a way that's super easy for him all the time.
Right.
In this case, effort was expended and resistance was made, and yet he overcame in order to see what Daniel asked for to come about.
He felt it was worth it.
Yeah. But it just shows you another aspect of when we pray, it's not it just doesn't disappear, and it isn't a simple thing. But the other part of this is we are God's representatives to this city and to this nation. In Revelation, one of the things you notice is right to the angel of the church of Sardis, or the angel of and it's to the people of the church.
Right.
And we represent, to some extent, this force for good that resists Satan and preserves this city. Like, that's who we are. And so, we play a role in this. And when we talk about not only gospel armor and things, we have a role in that fight. And we represent God in it. And we might get resistance, but that doesn't mean we give up.
Right. We need to do our part of struggling for 21 days to overcome the challenge. And you'd mentioned it before, but at the end of 21 he says, none contends at my side except for Michael, your prince. And I don't know if that meant that he was Daniel's personal angel, or you as in the people of Israel.
Israel's.
Yeah, as a nation. But either way, that would be very encouraging and uplifting, knowing that you have, that you actually had someone, Michael, of all people, of all not people, but
Angelic beings.
yeah, someone so powerful, and that we would see would overcome the dragon later in Revelation, fighting on your side. Larry, did you have a comment?
No, I did.
Sorry about that. So again, as the angel finishes up this this encouraging pep talk for Daniel, he says that Michael fights with me, and I stood up with Michael in first year of Darius the Mede, and you just see the teamwork, the camaraderie of these angels working together, and it reminds me of just the family that we have here. That we can be a team together, and we can get each other's backs like this angel and Michael did, and be there to contend with each other in our struggles and our challenges, and then be able to celebrate our victories and ease and comfort each other in defeats. And that's God's design. And so it's just really important for us to participate fully with each other and to share our lives with each other so that we can have that advantage. Any last comments or questions before we close? All right, well, let's close with a word of prayer. Our God, we thank you so much for your word and the encouragement it provides, that we can read these accounts of people's experiences with you, and that we can gain from them examples of how we can live and how we can think and act. And we pray you will help us, that we can be drawn closer together as a congregation, that we can be there for each other and serve each other, and help us that we can also reach out to those in the community around us. And all these things we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.